Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to everybody online, depending on where you are. My name is Daniel Naujoks, and I direct the International Innovation UN Studies program at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. And today we have a great event that we are able to co-sponsor with several other programs across Columbia, including the Economic and Political Development Concentration, the Development Practice MPA, the Climate and Society Program, and my own program on international organizations. Again, this is just to show how many different actors and programs alone at CEPA, right, and at Columbia are involved in some of the issues that we are dealing with today. I have advised the United Nations on many of the issues around climate change, SDGs, and disaster risk, mostly with regard to migration and disaster and displacement, which is my own key area of expertise, but also in the broader sense. And today, it is my real privilege to say a few words about the new book, Creating Resilient Futures, Integrating Disaster Risk Reduction, Sustainable Development Goals, and Climate Change Adaptation Agendas, that was published early this year by Palgrave Macmillan. And one thing that is really great for everybody, not just everybody here on the call, but the world over, is that it's open access, right? So you can download the entire book for free and read all the great articles and get inspiration from the conceptualizations and the research that went into this book. The book is based on the three key international frameworks were adopted in 2015. Right, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Paris Agreement under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNCCC, and the UN's 2030 Agenda and their Sustainable Development Goals. And I assume most people on the call are familiar, particularly with the SDGs, maybe the Paris Agreement, and some of you also with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. But one thing that this book sets out to do is really to investigate why these different agendas have been treated in silos, and how does it actually look like when we approach them in a more integrated way. So it starts on page 2, and I'm quoting, systematic transformational change is called for to address the impacts of global climate change, unquote. And that's something at the UN, in larger development discussions among civil society, academics, etc., transformational change, systematic change, or we often talk about coherence and synergies and a lot of other keywords that have come up. The book also discusses that this is often jargon, right? I mean, we often in the UN and the development sphere, we talk about coherence, synergies, we throw these things around, but actually behind those concepts, or behind these ideas, are very meaningful concepts. But it is sometimes hard to know what it means to work on them meaningfully. And really, I think meaningfully is, like, for me, always the most important qualifier to understand, yeah, you work towards coherence between agendas, between actors, between discussions. But what does exactly coherence mean? Well, how do these coherences play out? The integration of these issues is often based on the fact that there's no zero-sum game. Like a zero-sum game is where you work on one thing that distracts from another thing. So there's some kind of conflict or competition. And again, coherence and synergy is based on the idea there is no zero-sum game. And in most cases, I believe when we point to zero-sum games, it's probably a wrong zero-sum game. However, I think when we think about these agendas, we have to understand that sometimes there can be trade-offs. Sometimes there is competition, there's conflict. The SDGs are the best example, right? The 17 global goals, there are 169 indicator targets, and there are 233 indicators that measure those targets, are supposed to be an integrated framework. But we also know that not everything is always going in the same direction. Having better access to to certain jobs, having certain ways of having higher income may increase the need for energy, which again then may have negative implications for climate change. So the real issue is that there are sometimes trade-offs, and we have to really understand where those trade-offs lie and how we can address them. A month ago, Hao Shu, who is Assistant Secretary General at the UN and the Director of UNDP's Bureau for Policy and Program Support, published a new blog post on our new multilateral action blog. So if you don't know this, and I put it in the chat later, my program launched a new blog called Multilateral Action. So Mr. Shu published a blog on reimagining development futures, what we can learn from UNDP's integrated and systems-driven approaches. Again, there, the Bureau, meaning the department of UNDP, the UN Development Program, that is tasked with SDG integration. They have an entire website on SDG integration. Muses about what it means to have an integrated systems-driven approach. And when you read the blog, I think they have some really interesting ideas. For example, the climate promise, where UNDP draws really on expertise across energy and forests and water and resilience, agriculture, health, youth, finance, governance, gender equality, green jobs, to actually work on climate. And you see how intersecting some of these issues are. But when you read the blog post too, and you follow some of the links that are in the post, you will see that in theory, this is often easy. In practice, to understand what really integration means is much, much harder. My own research is often on interagency cooperation, meaning how different UN action entities work together. And I work on UNDAFs, UN Development System Frameworks, that since 2019 have been renamed as UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Frameworks. And there, the idea again is about bringing actors together. And we know it's not just issues. Right now, we talk about these three agendas: disaster risk reduction, SDGs, and climate change adaptation. But it's not just the issues; it's actors acting in certain issue areas who have biases, who have interests, who have fundings. Right. So bringing actors together, not just issues, is often key when we think about integrating things. And one thing that really matters are processes. We have to include a variety of stakeholders, and most importantly, be able to give them a real voice, right? So beyond academic ideas that we have about these different areas of work, we have to understand who are the people on the ground for whom these silos and these differences may not matter as much, and give them a real voice so people on the ground, the vulnerable populations and communities, can actually, because for them, again, for climate change, adaptation and disaster risk and development may be much more closely linked than to some development actors. And the book actually talks about the institutional arrangements, about the Paris Agreement with the SDGs and disaster risk reduction studies have. So institutions and how we monitor, how we talk, how we have these discussions matter. The book actually puts forth an hourglass analogy. It says information flows between different areas like sand. And I think, so for an hourglass to flow in various directions, you have to manually flip the hourglass, right? From an hourglass, it doesn't manually go up, upside down, at least not in our universe. The reminder, the book is a good reminder to actually help us flip and help the sand flow in both directions. But maybe in the end, we want more something like a huge but still organized sandstorm where the sand particles freely mingle. But of course, then the key question becomes how to organize the chaos of a sandstorm. And I leave that to others to think about this my expanded analogy. I'm almost done just with my introductory remarks, and three more points. One is we need to adopt integrated finance frameworks. Like the financing has one of the key importance on how actors actually take decisions. How the UN, how NGOs, how governments actually make decisions, in large part depends on where money comes from, how the money is structured. And we've seen it in the divide between humanitarian aid and development aid and peace contributions, for example, right? Where these different funding streams make it very hard to work across the nexus of peace development and humanitarian relief. Another one is about creating meaningful indicators and metrics. And the book actually talks about that and suggests certain things, how to have meaningful indicators that are meaningful in itself, but also consider what happens in other ways. And this is really a very technical challenge that I think even the SDGs have not fully mastered. The last point I'm making is about local and municipal actors. And that's something that the book really stresses, that that's not just the international level. And we think about the Paris Agreement and the Sendai framework and the SDGs. We often think about New York. We think about the large discussions about heads of agencies, etc. But really bringing it down to the local level, having cities, having subnational actors, in addition to non-state stakeholders, really be part of these discussions and drive what's there is really important, with a little caveat that some actions just remain reserved to national governments, especially when it comes to norm setting and for real impacts about industry standards, etc. But I leave it here. I think it's a very good book. It gives a lot of insights and ideas and very tangible ideas how to advance this, and I hope that we can all learn from it. And I look forward to the great discussions and flash presentations by our panelists today.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Thank you so much for your opening remarks and for setting the context of the book and giving your insights into the key issues, the key messages across it. Just going to share, I'm going to have a presentation here, so I'm just going to share some slides. So today, Daniel's given an overview, opening remarks, opening address to the book. I'm going to give a brief overview of the book itself. And then we have summaries of the different chapters from a number of authors who've been able to join us today. So Adam, Cathy, Glen, and then Gina, there's a pre-recording of Gina's talk. She couldn't make it just due to time differences. She's over in Malaysia. And then we have plenty of time for a moderated discussion towards the end of the session that Jennifer Duggan will be presenting as well. We're lucky to have Jennifer, editor and journalist from Time magazine as well, to act as our moderator in the session. So just to start, I'd just like to give my thanks to those that contributed to the book. So from our institution, the Marai Center in UCC, all the chapter authors, all the editors on the book. So Yair, Martin, Barry, and myself, all contributing to the book to make it into a reality. Also the funders, so the Irish Environmental Protection Agency and the European Interreg Project Climate as well, funded to make the book an open access offering as well, which, as Daniel touched on as well, is really important. The ethos of the book is that it can be shared openly and people can download as they wish and access to knowledge, so there isn't a paywall there. A kind of high-level elevator pitch summary of the book is what the book hopes to achieve. It's a message of hope, and it's how we can connect and improve resilience outcomes by harnessing a range of ideas across communities. And these communities are operating at different scales, and we're looking across a whole different range of practitioners and disciplines and everything else that has come to kind of create this book. The book structure, it's structured around initially looking at the idea of best practice approaches. I'll just go back a couple of slides because I think I jumped ahead. So the book itself is looking, as Daniel said, it's looking at building coherence, as a coherence building opportunity between the three different agendas that were discussed. So the Paris Agreement in 2015, focusing on climate change adaptation, the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. So we're looking at the opportunities to connect these different agendas together and looking at this idea of integration as a continuum rather than a siloed approach. The book itself, it starts off with three conceptual chapters that really frame the work and then follows it with a number of case studies within the Irish context and the international context. And then today I'm going to present as well on some lessons learned from the book, as well as some challenges and potential solutions. So we start off with Martin Letitia and Hester White, looking at making connections through resilience indicators. So the whole idea of the value of looking at indicators, at metrics, of how to measure, how to count what we're doing, how to put some kind of accountability and evaluation in terms of how we are achieving resilience through climate change adaptation actions, through disaster risk reduction action, and through the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. So looking across the 3 agendas to see where there might be connections between to create indicators. Then Doug Cubby and Tommaso Natali, who I note are on the call, they developed the Hourglass framework, and their chapters looking at the legal relationship, focusing on coherence, alignment, and integration between the 3 agendas. An excellent chapter as well, looking at really teasing out those legal relationships and the legal standing for working across the agendas. As we know, those legal foundations are really important in terms of achieving outcomes, in terms of getting binding agreements. The next chapter is by Shona Patterson and Kristen Guida, and that's looking at connecting climate change, looking at disaster risk reduction, climate change risk assessments, and connecting them together in terms of climate change adaptation agendas. So it's looking at bridging the gaps between risk assessments and climate change adaptation. There are the foundation of the book in terms of the conceptual chapters. And then we have a number of chapters looking focused on sort of Irish case study examples. So Peter Medway, myself, Doug Cubby and Martin Letitia looking at integrating disaster risk and climate change adaptation into the Irish emergency planning. And this was based on an Irish Environmental Protection Agency project, and really gleaned the insights from the project in terms of actually making those integration, where this is a good example of where the disaster risk reduction community and the climate change adaptation community or policies even aren't necessarily talking to each other or even referencing each other at times. So how we can overcome these this kind of siloed approach. Glen Smith, who we're also lucky to have on the call and be presenting today, is talking about local governments networks, and he focused on a case study example in Youghal in Cork, and Glen will discuss that in his presentation forthcoming. Then Cathy Burns, myself, and Barry O'Dwyer, and Cathy again is on the call today, and we'll give her presentation looking at mainstreaming climate change adaptation into planning and development in the north of Ireland, so in Northern Ireland. We then move into the more international focused case studies. So Muriel Soman and Xavier Rebello, and this is here from the University of Cape Town. They're looking at a South African perspective focused in on small scale fisheries, the small scale fishery sector. And again, looking at building connections between the 3 agendas from a bottom up perspective in this case. Yair Gutierrez Columba, author, also editor on the book as well, co-editor on the book, has focused in on looking at how the Global South focused in on the Caribbean and had Caribbean itself. Lessons from the Global South can actually feed through and be useful and impactful in terms of how we manage looking at disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation and the Sustainable Development Goals. So essentially, those in the Global North can learn a lot from people, practitioners and academics and researchers in the Global South that have been working on this topic for a long time as well. Sui Kyung Wong and Regina Garai Abula looking at a case study example of Riverine community based in Sarawak in Malaysia. And Gina will be presenting through a pre-recorded message, a pre-recorded presentation on the session as well. And then last but not least, we have we're lucky as well to have Adam Rogers join us on the call, and he's looking at how we can look at changes in diet and dietary decisions and choices, and how they connect through to more sustainable eating, more sustainable development, and looking specifically at a number of the Sustainable Development Goals in doing so. So that's our suite of chapters. Some of the lessons that we gleaned from across the range of chapters include the acknowledgement that each of the agendas recognize resilience as an integral feature. So we framed the book around this idea of resilience. So they recognize resilience as an integral feature of implementation of success. And resilience can provide a means of building linkages and coordination that can increase the effectiveness of agendas individually and collectively as well. So collectively, the agendas can contribute to creating a coherent framing for climate resilience in particular, but it's provided that they are implemented in support of each other, so that they talk to each other, that they, as Daniel had said as well, the different agents involved in the system and different institutions, organizations and agencies talk to each other as well and share share information is a big part of that as well. And in practice, we can use tools such as indicators, transferable tools that can align policies and manage processes as well, and as a means to avoid this siloed approach that often occurs across these different domains that have very similar agendas and objectives, but often aren't looked at in a continuum. They're looked at in isolation from each other. Some of the challenges associated with linking these different agendas is this balance between autonomy and integration. So obviously, it's useful to integrate and to coordinate and to work together, but you also need to have some level of autonomy between agencies and some level of ownership between different agents and agencies at different levels, from kind of national, regional to local as well. So it's trying to find that correct balance between the two. Looking at the idea of data management that allows integrating across different disciplines and topics, and that's a big issue in terms of how data is stored, how data is shared, and how different data sets can be used to populate, for example, different indicators as well. A big thing, a cross-cutting issue that came out from many of the chapters is this idea of consistency or agreement of language and terminology. So I think if social scientists are on the call or others would realize this is a big issue in our area, where you're trying to speak to, especially when you're looking at transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work, to try and agree on common understandings of what different terms are, what different language we should be using, to try and look for commonalities in terms of language use, in terms of terms that we agree what they mean, as a kind of foundation for working together. So that's quite a big issue and quite a challenging one as well. Climate justice. So we need to take a climate justice approach to rightfully frame global warming, this example, as an ethical and political issue. And this is a real challenge when carrying out this work, that we're looking at the most vulnerable, and we're aware of justice and intergenerational justice issues. But this is also, I think, an opportunity as well for the work, that we can really harness this climate justice and loss and damage narrative to realize some of the opportunities that are there. Finally, on the challenges, policies and plans to the agendas, they're often developed iteratively, but in a narrow way, and they deal with one issue at a time. So this is a kind of, again, just talking about this idea of avoiding this silo risk. The final slide, looking at potential solutions. So we need to recognize that risks increasingly have interdependencies and cascading effects across different sectors that can't be addressed through any one agreement or through any one geographical domain as well. So that we're seeing more and more research and work looking at the independency and the cascading nature of risk. And that's, while it's a very challenging area, it's a good approach to be taking to look at the interconnectedness across and between systems. Enhancing integration at domestic level, it can reduce duplication and optimize the use of resources and sharing of technical expertise, as well as supporting coherence at the international level. So when you have a government reporting on adaptation actions, that they would link in with their sustainable development goal actions or the disaster risk actions, for example, that they're not reported in 3 separate streams, but there's some coordination between the 3 that will arguably enhance all 3 and increase improve your objectives and your outcomes. Under the banner of increasing resilience, there's potential to embed these agendas across government functions. So if you are aiming towards, if you can agree that the goal is to reduce vulnerability, improve capacity, and reduce resilience across government functions, that's a good way of focusing the work. Local communities can work in partnership with NGOs and other partners to contribute their knowledge and their experience. So there's an awful lot of knowledge within the communities and within local groups that wouldn't necessarily be often have their voice heard in terms of experts' advice. So it's trying to get that community voice and local knowledge through. They're experiencing effective climate change and disasters firsthand, and they have practical proposals for dealing with climate change in particular and promoting sustainable development, sustainable livelihoods. So it's getting that community voice through co-production processes as well. And then finally, on the solutions, the idea of transdisciplinary and decolonizing approaches to these 3 different agendas. And this offers opportunities for addressing climate justice challenges through, again, harnessing knowledge and the voices and ownership of early adopters in the global south. So the book itself is available through the Springer, it's Palgrave website. That's for free, open access, or through purchase as well if you wish. We're lucky we've had nearly 10,000 downloads to date, and the book was published at the start of November, and there's a discount code there as well that's available on, it's well publicized on social media, and I'll send it on after this talk as well to those that registered and participated. So there's a code to get the book if you want to buy it, but if not, you can download it for free, as I said, from the Palgrave Macmillan Springer website. And that's my social media details as well, where you can find more information on the book and upcoming events associated with these topics. So I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll introduce our first speaker. So we're going to have a series of speakers talking briefly on their chapters. So our first speaker is Adam Rogers. Adam was born in Arizona and he grew up in Canada's Yukon, and he's a journalist and a veteran of the United Nations for 22 years. He worked with the UN. He's currently a consultant and advisor, and he writes extensively on sustainability topics. So his 2019 book is the Non-Mammal Manifesto, a diet for a new and more sustainable world. And he's also more recently written a book called Taking Action Online for the Environment, Social Justice and Sustainable Development. So Adam, you have the floor to give your presentation on your chapter looking at sustainable food choices. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Stephen. It's a bit daunting, I'd say, to be going first in front of all of these great academics and friends and colleagues who are much more accomplished in the area of research than I am. But as a journalist, a lot of my research comes from more of a popular perspective and journalists to get information, I think, that people can use. And so this book, the No Mammal Manifesto, from which a lot of the material for this chapter came from and was updated, targets, yes, policymakers, but also individuals to make informed choices on their diets and to show that choices in all areas of our lives have repercussions, have consequences. And by becoming aware of what those consequences are, we can adjust our lives. And also we can try and encourage our policymakers, our local and national officials to enact policies that are conducive, more conducive with the survival of our species on this planet. As with all choices, it's not a black and white area. There's a lot of choices in our lives that if taken in moderation, are not actually that bad for us. Like if we enjoy a drink every now and then, it's not that bad. But if we drink too excessively, that might not be great for our health. And the things we do may not be great for the planet. So keeping that in mind, it's not pushing for a pure vegan diet, although that is obviously more conducive to a sustainable lifestyle. But it's trying to nudge society in the direction and a policy of producing, especially and consuming less mammal meat in particular. So let me quickly, I have a presentation mainly to keep me focused because I have a tendency to digress a bit when I talk about issues that I get excited about, and I could digress in different directions. And I want to keep this short so that our other interesting and accomplished speakers can go ahead. So I'm going to touch on these four areas and just have a couple of slides on the economic, environmental, and health implications and how they relate to different SDGs, but the implications of our dietary decisions. So the underlying assumptions that I have here are, one is that our choice of food and how that food is produced has a significant impact on most of the 17 SDGs. And both personal and policy choices should be informed, obviously, and supportive of SDG achievement. Because if we're making, ignorance sometimes is an excuse, but it's not, if it's ongoing and the actions of which, consequences of which we're ignorant are having negative impacts, then it's a good idea to, then once we're informed, then we, should make our decisions in the right direction. So the societal cost, so if we're talking true cost economics, that's when you integrate all of the costs of a product or a service into the cost of that product or service. So if there are negative externalities that are not priced in, we end up having to pay for them anyway, or those people who are not involved in that activity end up having to pay for them. Somebody has to pay, because there is no free lunch when we're eating lunch. And even if it's a cheaper lunch and it's free lunch, we think it's free, but it's not. So if you're taking, 2,500 gallons of water, 12 pounds of grains, 34 pounds of topsoil, and a lot of energy to produce a pound of feedlot beef, but we're only paying, like, say, $1.50 for that, or $2 at McDonald's, there are other ways that we're going to have to pay for it. For example, the filtering and cleaning the water in a lot of communities around the world, starting in the United States, because that's where a lot of this a lot of these issues first came, but now it's being unfortunately replicated in many other parts of the world, where they have to build these massive, expensive filtration systems just to clean the water so we can drink it. You know, Des Moines, Iowa, or you have Des Moines, Iowa spent nearly $4 million. Hiawatha, Kansas, $3.5 million. Chino, California, just to build these massive plants to clean all the nitrates and the phosphates out of the water. And they get in there from all the fertilizers, the chemical fertilizers that are used to grow the crops that are used to feed the cows that are used to produce the beef. There's also obesity-related healthcare costs. So our insurance premiums keep going up because they have to cover the healthcare of those who aren't eating diets, eating diets that could be nudged in a different direction to be healthier. The carbon costs and climate change. If you factor all these efforts, we should be paying 53 cents extra for a burger. So the question is, if we want, for those who want to eat beef, we're not saying, okay, now everybody has to stop eating beef, but why should others have to subsidize it? So it should be policy, in my opinion, that, policy directives that kind of, lessen the burden on those not eating it, so that they'd have to pay for it. Some people fly around in private jets. Those of us flying economy, shouldn't necessarily have to subsidize the private jets for those who want to travel in them. Environmental. The Union of Concerned Scientists have declared that, and the thousands of scientists from around the world, accomplished scientists, many of them Nobel Prize winners, that the production and consumption of mammal meat is the second most environmentally harmful consumer activity in the world. So if for example, you're in the most impactful is the combustion engine and the consumption of carbon-based fuels. So if you're, say, in China and you're eating a steak that was produced in Brazil, and that is Brazil's biggest export now is beef to China, and then it was transported on a ship burning fossil fuel, then it's like a double whammy. I mean, it's not sustainable. We can't keep doing it. And in more and more countries, China is the most recent, but others, India's coming up. All countries have a right to develop and to develop on their own terms. But when it tips the balance and the planet sinks, we need to find more efficient ways. The inefficient farming of cattle feed, I just mentioned that. Methane emissions from cows and fertilizers use is creating so many greenhouse gases as all the world's cars, trucks, and airplanes combined. So all the production of these cows is producing as much carbon contribution to climate change as all of the combustion engines in the world combined. The livestock industry has already degraded 20% of the world's pasture land, overgrazing by cutting down rainforests and growing feed for cows. And rainforests can only a few years, and then they have to move on and cut down more rainforests. It's the tropical rainforest destruction. Beef, again, it's the single most destructive force. You also have soy, palm oil, wood products, and others, but beef, growing cows now is the most destructive force that is taking down our rainforests. So this is a satellite picture of the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Texas and Louisiana, where all these rivers are running down, filled with phosphates and nitrates from the fertilizers used in the American Midwest to grow crops to feed to cows, to produce steak, so we can all have our T-bones. So what happens is that it flows down there, and all of that, these nitrates, it creates these algae blooms. It's fertilizer, so it creates these algae blooms that suck the oxygen out of the water and kill all the seafood. So all the seafood industry has been destroyed. There's everybody put out of work because you have to travel somewhere else. You can't catch fish anywhere along there anymore because of that. Health, let's go into the health industry. Studies show that if you eat 4 ounces of mammal meat a day, they're more likely to die of cancer or heart disease. I recently found out that the sons of beef-eating mothers have a third of sperm concentration. Men who eat, see, messages like that kind of resonate. Maybe people take action more quickly, especially men. Oh my God, okay, I want my son to be a man, so all right, stop eating meat. Okay, men who eat more than 2 red meat servings a daily have a 28% higher risk of having a stroke. There's the Eat Foundation in Norway, and the Lancet produced a report last year showing that we could have a hamburger a week, maybe a steak a week if it's a small steak, and then this doesn't apply to you. So it's not a matter of going cold turkey with the beef, but it's again being aware of the consequences of it, and also of excess. Anything in excess obviously has negative or can have adverse effects on our health or on the environment. So people who eat a single serving of red meat each day have a 19% higher risk. The World Health Organization has actually labeled processed mammal meat as a type 1 carcinogen. unprocessed mammal meat is a type 2 carcinogen, but both of them, according to the World Health Organization, are carcinogens. So again, it's doing it every day. So if you eat chicken or turkey each day instead of beef or pork, you have a 13% reduced stroke risk over those, et cetera. So it's a matter of reducing if we can. So conclusions. Again, these are from the book and updated through research for this chapter, but it's being conscious of the origin and impact of our dietary decisions. On a personal level, if we can go up to the policy level in countries that are developing, even especially, and showing them that there are alternatives, will keep the people healthier. Americans, speaking as an American, we're reducing our beef consumption slowly, much to the chagrin of the American Meat Association. They're not happy about that, and they're launching counter campaigns trying to get us to eat more. There's studies on the veggie burger where they took all these construction workers and they had like a double-blind test, and they had a beef burger and a veggie burger, and overwhelmingly the ones that ate the veggie burger, they thought they were eating beef and they felt fuller and more energy than those who ate the beef. So they didn't. So there are studies to show that it's just taking that leap of faith. These are other conclusions that government policies. So supporting sound government policies that encourage healthy food choices and ensure access to affordable, nutritious food. A lot of countries, including our own, people with low incomes can't afford anything else, and they have a couple of kids. They want to make sure everybody has a meal every time, and the way the policies are set up and the subsidies, it encourages eating food that's not so nutritious. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Adam, for your presentation. A lot of ideas to think on there in terms of our way that we can live in a more sustainable way with the planet, and all the chapter as well. It's all grounded within different sustainable development goals as well. So it shows how you can apply the sustainable development goals and how they're overarching. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Cathy Burns. So Cathy has a background in museum, natural and cultural heritage and built heritage. She's about 20 years of experience working in the public sector and NGOs, specializing in project management, communication and engagement topics. She's the climate officer for Derry City and Duggan District Council, and through the climate project, the Interreg funded project, developed the first climate change adaptation plan for a council in Northern Ireland, and that's what she's going to speak on now in her presentation. So the floor is yours, Cathy. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Yeah. All right. Yeah, so thanks very much for allowing us to be involved in the book and to be a co-author on the chapter and to be able to come along here and speak this evening. As Stephen says, I'm the Climate Programme Manager for Derry City and Strabane District Council. So for those of you who don't know, Derry and in the northwest of Northern Ireland, the UK, but importantly we have a land border with the Republic of Ireland, so 140 kilometres of our council area borders Donegal County Council in the Republic, which is a key factor when we consider climate action and disaster risk reduction. The chapter within the book that looks at the adaptation planning journey and the wider climate action journey in Derry City and Strabane District Council. So we're not a huge council. We have just over 150,000 people in our area. For Northern Ireland, councils have a broad remit in terms of what you would expect for a local council or a local authority. So things like waste management, refuge collection, leisure centres, all those nice things, as well as planning, spatial planning, land and economic reach, as well as museums and heritage and those sorts of things. So quite a big remit and quite a big responsibility, as well as often being frontline response to severe weather events and climate impacts. It's often the council who are there, in the midst of it when there is, for instance, a severe flood event. Council are often there responding, helping with cleanups, helping give community support. So we're very much frontline in terms of responses to climate action or climate change. So our climate action journey really began through the NPA Interreg funded project to develop, as Stephen outlined, the Council's Climate First Adaptation Plan. It's important to note, as we outlined, that there is currently no statutory authorities in Northern Ireland to undertake climate action. We're the only part of the UK who's as yet do not have a Climate Change Act at a local level. So there is that policy vacuum and there is that legislative gap for us here in Northern Ireland. Councils are progressing and they're really grasping the nettle and working away in the background in terms of delivering action on the ground, because we see that it's a moral and an ethical imperative that we deliver climate action, but also that we work to protect our citizens and our local ratepayers. So to that end, the key factors and the key drivers really are very much around, you know, maintaining business as usual in the event of a climate severe weather event, for instance, but also, as I said, protecting our citizens, but also maintaining and future-proofing our city and district against the future effects of climate change. And we have a huge remit as I outlined, in terms of regeneration, but also in terms of our planning functions to make sure that we're making the right decisions at a local level. So the key factors really to deliver climate action in the council and our climate action journey focused around things such as leadership, those policy frameworks that we have internally, coordination mechanisms, our information data and tools, as well as supporting financial processes. And one of the key challenges, as Daniel outlined at the start, was around breaking down those institutions and those barriers. This concept for us in council. Climate action isn't something that councils ordinarily do as part of their business as usual in Northern Ireland. So it was important that we involved as many stakeholders as possible across council and really just communicated to them why climate action matters and what it means to them. At a very practical level, you know, on a Monday morning, what does it mean to the refuge manager in terms of climate action? What does climate adaptation or disaster risk reduction mean to the grounds maintenance team, for instance? So really practical things around getting buy-in and getting that support. So we managed to do that. We set up a climate action working group with officers, with our elected members as well. So we have an all-party climate working group, which, as you can imagine, in Northern Ireland isn't always an easy thing to get all the parties around the same table agreeing on the same issue, but we managed to do that. So we've really seen how the climate adaptation planning process has acted as a catalyst for the further climate action. So we're looking at mitigation now, looking at our carbon baselines and our net zero carbon roadmaps. We have a climate screening process now in council where all policies and all decisions have to be screened for climate risk in terms of climate adaptation, but also mitigation opportunities. We have a climate pledge. So council has came out and publicly declared its stance that the city and district will be net zero and resilient by 2045. And we're looking to integrate the sustainable development goals as a key screening methodology for all our decisions as well. So we're looking at an SDG tag tool at the moment and how we can apply that across the board in all council services operations. And then, as I mentioned before, critically, a big our work is looking at that transboundary and cross-border basis. So as I mentioned, we are a border county with Donegal and the Republic of Ireland. So we are now working collaboratively together because we recognise obviously climate change doesn't respect the border. You know, if it's going to flood here in Donegal, it's likely to be flooding in Derry as well. And that has that has consequences for how we respond and disaster risk reduction in terms of coordinated emergency planning. So we're developing a Northwest Climate Action Framework and Transboundary Northwest Climate Action Plan as well, which is the first of its kind on the island of Ireland. And then just in terms of the reflections and the lessons learned, the detail around, you know, what are those leaderships abilities, the knowledge and information gaps that there existed, the capacity building that was needed in order to break down those silos, and the governance arrangements that were needed as well to really put a framework together and put a real framework around climate action and adaptation in particular in the council. So yeah, that's a quick summary, I suppose, Stephen. I'm conscious there isn't much time, so I know I'll be able to answer questions later on if need be.
Thanks a million, Cathy. Thanks so much for that. It's great to get a really good overview of the process and how it's managed at a local level as well, in terms of getting that buy-in, in terms of yourself being important to have a champion within council to kind of drive through the agenda as well. So they're lucky to have you in Derry City and Strabane. I'm going to present next my colleague, former colleague Glen Smith, and Glen is a social scientist who works in marine and coastal socio-ecological systems. He's a research fellow currently at Middlesex University, and his background's in marine spatial planning with an interest in governance, power participation, and process transparency. So Glen is going to be presenting on his chapter, which is looking at local climate action networks, a case study from Cork. So the floor is yours, Glen. Thank you very much.
Cool, thanks very much, Stephen. I guess you can hear me? See if there's a thumb up there. Yep, cool. So in a way, this kind of leads on. Cathy has kind of brought some of these themes crashing kind of down to earth, I suppose, by focusing more in on the local, which is where I'm going to stay for this brief introduction to my contribution to the chapter, which also I'd like to echo the thanks of the other speakers as well for the opportunity to Stephen, the other editors. I'm not sure if any of them here. I haven't looked at the participant list for a moment, but thanks for the opportunity to take part in this project and also to present and discuss ideas here. So I conducted this research while I was at University College Cork at Mara, UCC in Ireland, through the BecoMar project. And this was basically a project where we looked at ways of building coastal and marine resilience. So the idea being that we would find ways in and around coastal communities to figure out what resilience meant locally and how that might be improved and built. So I suppose in terms of the integration of the three main overarching themes of this book, this chapter really has climate adaptation as a central kind of route through that, and something that binds a lot of these issues together, I guess. And there's a protagonist in the chapter as well. C. O'Connor was kind of Cork City's answer to Greta Thunberg, and she led months and months of Fridays for Change, or I forget exactly what the slogan was, but she bunked off school for months and months and sat outside the town hall in Cork City, protesting, and a bit of background noise there, but protesting against the Irish government's perceived inaction on climate change. And her motto in these protests was that the emperor has no clothes. And by this, she was trying to say that national Irish policy on climate change, if you look into the detail of it, basically didn't provide very much or enough to tackle this key issue. She was essentially saying that the Irish government was naked. And this inspired me to look into this idea more, not to look more closely at a naked Irish government exactly, but to look more closely at what it was that the policies were proposing and providing. And I took a governance approach to this, seeing governance as key to delivering on climate change adaptation. Governance being the organization of people, how people are organized, how people self-organize. And in the chapter, I do provide a couple of examples where I take policy excerpts from national through to regional and down to local level, and look at exactly what the policies are proposing and start finding gaps there. And unfortunately, this is where this running theme of silos did start to emerge, and some of these policies weren't providing enough overlap, or were kind of chasing different priorities. So partly climate change adaptation in Ireland is done sector by sector, for example. So there are 12 sectors that need to or have produced their climate change adaptation strategies. And perhaps there were opportunities missed here to provide more overlap between them. The governance infrastructure in Ireland is actually quite impressive. If you look at all the different committees and how they work together and how they're linked and how they communicate, and the opportunities for public participation in those and public contribution to what it means, first of all, to see the effects of climate change and what it might mean to develop adaptation and build resilience in the face of climate change. The Citizens' Assembly, for example, is a great one where 99 or 100 people across the country are brought together to answer questions on how these things might be achieved. And another thing I did is looked specifically at the town of Youghal, which is in County Cork. It's east of Cork City and pretty much the last town before you cross the county border over into Waterford. And Youghal has a bit of a disadvantaged background. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that this is what I've heard from a lot of people, both in Youghal and people who have been there, is that there's kind of general agreement that the Celtic Tiger economic boom kind of bypassed Youghal a bit. So irrespective of the subsequent economic crash, that there are opportunities that perhaps didn't fall the way of Youghal. But it's also a very innovative town. It's a town of about 9,000 people. And since then, it's really seized on its natural and cultural heritage to attract visitors, both domestic to Ireland and international tourists. And it has also hosted Ireland's first Ironman triathlon. So that really kind of put it on the map. It does punch above its weight a little bit in terms of attracting that kind of investment. But unfortunately, it's also quite flood prone, being a coastal / estuary town. A lot of the town centre is actually built on reclaimed land. And if you look at some of the flood patterns, floods unfortunately are occurring more regularly in the town, and they follow very regular patterns. And so you can look at flood reports 10 years apart from 2004 and 2014 and see that the same areas are being affected and perhaps not enough is being done to mitigate those impacts. Daniel mentioned at the beginning the importance of financing. And one of the examples, I'll just kind of finish on one example from Youghal and then could provide more detail in question time if anybody requires, is that part of the innovation of a town like Youghal is they've produced a very kind of strong heritage-led vision to attract tourists to the area. But there are a couple of considerations perhaps that weren't taken into account, such as the infrastructure to deal with that influx of people to a relatively small town. And also what ways, I mean, this vision that was produced actually makes no, it was produced in 2016 and makes no reference to climate whatsoever. So to conclude, what we found was that there is actually an opportunity not only to use national and regional governance structures, but also informal local governance networks, because communities govern themselves all the time in a myriad of different ways. In this example, through the vision in Youghal, it was to attract more tourists to with a heritage-led approach. But we kind of, the idea of this chapter really is to sort of highlight opportunities to use those local strengths to implement some of the things that would support a better integration of these three overarching themes. So there's a brief kind of overview. Sorry, I didn't give you any pretty pictures to look at, but thanks very much, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Glen. It was a really nice deep dive into governance across Ireland in terms of different scales and national down to local, and the case study example in Youghal as well. And there'll be time in questions to interrogate some of that further. I'd like to present the final speaker before we go into the panel open discussion, moderated discussion. So Regina Garai is joining us remotely, so she has a pre-recording. And she researches community development and marginalized communities, especially in Malaysia, in Sarawak. And she's a lecturer at the University of Sarawak there. She's experienced researcher with interests in socioeconomic dynamics of rural and coastal communities and how communities cope and manage around issues of climate change, food security, sustainable livelihoods, etc. I'm going to share a video. Let's see how this works. So I'll share my desktop. And we should be able to pick up on Gina as well. Let me just close that down. Sorry, I thought it would be. And just make sure that the volume is set. Okay.
Hello. Greetings from University Malaysia Sarawak. I am Regina Garai.
It's very soft, Stephen.
And I
The volume.
Okay, I'll see what I can do. Let's see. I'm not sure if it goes much higher, Daniel. We don't need to. We might skip this if it doesn't. Oh, I don't think it goes much higher than that. So we'll try that again. And if it's too quiet, we can just leave this one.
Chapter in this book. So our chapter focuses on how a local
still quite quiet
here in Sarawak cope with economic and climatic stresses and shock, and how they increase the disaster risk reduction capability and adapt to climate change. The community that we are studying is located in Sadong Jaya, about 1 hour drive from Kuching, the state capital of Sarawak here in Borneo. This riverine community is located at the downstream of Sadong Jaya and actually shares its coastline with the South China Sea. There are about 25 settlements altogether in this community, with 3,176 households and 14,937 people. Because of its geographical location, the area is prone to flooding. Riverine or coastal flooding is a common type of natural disaster experienced by low-lying settlements such as in Sadong Jaya. In the recent years, the flooding and its aftermath are becoming more unpredictable and uncontrollable. The community also explained that they are experiencing droughts which are getting more severe and unpredictable. Discussion with the locals indicated that this unpredictability was caused by a number of economic development activities. For example, increased land use for oil palm cultivation and increased land use for infrastructure development, such as road development in the settlement, among other things. So trapped water from flooding, droughts, and so on cause disturbed ecosystem, which cannot cope with the accelerated impact of climate change. So what was once a healthy forest ecosystem is now showing signs of degradation that results in rainwater not flowing through the natural channel into the sea or not efficiently absorbed by the soil. So apart from that, flash floods occurs more regularly and cause damages not just to household items but also affecting crops and livestock. Despite this high disaster risk vulnerability faced by the riverine community in Sadong Jaya, the community managed to enhance their resilience through a reactive rebound system and proactive carrying capacity building for adaptation. Over the years, the community has developed its capability through a dynamic learning curve to face climate hazards and risk. The community has, in fact, adapted quite well to survive and even thrive under circumstances of limited access to different capital assets, especially their access to natural capital because of climate change, and also irreversible anthropogenic activities. So how do they adapt is by one, having livelihood diversification strategies to increase their household resilience, having strong links with institutions and agencies, and having more infrastructure development in the area to reduce the effects of flooding. In conclusion, this chapter highlights how a riverine community adapts to changes in the local ecosystem, which were the results of climate change and unsustainable practices. So as we experience the adverse impact of climate change, some groups may be more vulnerable than others. A strong and comprehensive community strategy for capacity building to reduce climate change related risk and to increase local resilience is very much needed, as illustrated by the community in Sadong Jaya that we talked about in this chapter. Thank you.
Thanks, folks, and thanks for your patience if the sound was quite on that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Duggan to the discussion. Jennifer has kindly offered to act as a moderator for the panel discussion now. So Jennifer works for Climate Magazine as an editor, and also has worked extensively as a journalist in the area of climate, and has formerly worked with the Mary Robinson Climate Justice Foundation as well. So welcome, Jennifer. If you'd like to take the floor and start the discussion.
Yeah,
Thanks.
great. Thanks, Stephen. I thought we'd kick it off this evening with a couple of questions, and then if anybody wants to ask questions, feel free to either raise your hand or drop them into the chat, and we can have those questions addressed to the chapter authors as well. So first of all, I thought it might be worth looking at some of the world is currently experiencing the dual challenges of climate change and COVID-19. And I just wanted to ask each of the authors here today, how do you think the international community is handling these two threats? And are there lessons that can be learned from the global pandemic response for tackling climate change, disaster risk, sustainable development and building resilience? And has the pandemic highlighted vulnerabilities that need to be looked at? I suppose, Stephen, if you yourself want to kick off with an answer on that.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'll just be brief. So yeah, I think that what the pandemic has done is definitely uncover a lot of vulnerabilities across societies. It's definitely showed the inequity between those in the global south in terms of vaccine access and those in the global north, where vaccine access in the global south is something in the region of 5 to 10%, where it's 60% plus, and in some countries in the global north, more like 80-90% vaccine access. So it's really impacting people's livelihoods. And I think it's been interesting to be living in Ireland at the moment and to see the impact of Storm Barra as the Atlantic storm rolled in the middle of the pandemic as well. It's impacted in terms of closing vaccination centres, and we're really seeing, I think, some of the people the most vulnerable in terms of also employment. Those that have secure employment opportunities are able to keep working from home, like ourselves on this call, but many people are forced to not be able to work because they're in hospitality and other sectors like that. So it really is showing some of the vulnerabilities in society. I think the Irish government is trying as best they can to provide supports, but it's not sustainable, and it really, these impacts will be felt more and more in terms of impact around climate disasters as well. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that, initial thoughts on that question. So if any other of the authors would be interested to add to that, or anyone in the discussion.
Yeah, if I could come in on that, Stephen, please.
Yeah, Cathy.
Yeah, I suppose speaking from a local authority perspective, we actually produced a recent report looking at a post-COVID-19 green recovery. But as part of that, we did a bit of an analysis around what the response was and the lessons that we had learned. And absolutely, you know, the pandemic highlighted that it is the most vulnerable in our society who are most at risk from global shocks at a local level. So we've seen a huge increase in, for instance, food bank look having to be delivered. We have social deprivation anyway, but terms of vulnerability that has increased as a result of, as you said, Stephen, you know, reduced work and things like that. So it also highlighted our food security issues here in the Northwest. And what we did learn in terms of lessons was how we responded. And again, it was very much community-led response in partnership with council. And what we learned as well was that we can make huge, very fast, very drastic changes when we want to. You know, so we're all working from home, which was something that would have been unheard of in council over 2 years ago. And also council has worked a lot more with community groups on the ground. So we're seeing how that mobilization can happen very quickly. So although very devastating, there are some benefits that have come out of the pandemic in terms of lessons learned and ways of working.
Glen, I see you have your hand raised next.
Yeah, just very quickly, because again, it leads on well from what Cathy says there. I think that we have, all of us in some ways, despite the devastation, also experienced ways in which communities are, you know, different sized communities at different levels, and different individuals and businesses can actually be quite resilient. There's a form of resilience that's emerged that we perhaps were unaware of. And partly that lies in what Cathy says there, the speed of certain people, arguably lucky people and institutions who are able to adapt, but that ability under pressure to adapt, I think, provides some hope. It's a question, I suppose, of communicating the same urgency to these other topics, such as climate change.
I think, Adam, have you got your hand raised?
Yeah, I was just at, for most of the this pandemic period, I've been working closely with UNDP in Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and Guinea-Bissau, and by extension with the local and national governments, mostly in Ukraine. So one of the main topics of discussion now are the economic stimulus packages at the policy level, and how they can be used and targeted to stimulate economic activity, get people back to work and improve livelihoods, but where to target that and how that can be targeted towards low carbon solutions. Creating opportunities for people who are dependent on coal mines in Ukraine, for example. And so looking at ways that the pandemic response to raise, to improve the economy and to get people back to work can be done in a low carbon and resilient manner. It's very important in countries around the world, even in the OECD DAC countries, if economic stimulus packages are being considered as a way to move socioeconomic activity out of the slump that took place during the pandemic. Let's do it in a carbon sort of friendly manner and get help get economies accelerating them in this decade of action for the SDGs.
Yeah, it certainly seems that there's lessons to be learned. I was just wondering too that the issue of climate justice. I know this is something that comes up in this book, and it was certainly a prominent topic at the UN climate talks, COP26 this year. Can you speak in relation to the responses to climate change and adaptation, and how do we ensure that those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change are sufficiently taken care of? Glen, I'll start with you because I know that your work touches on this, and I guess Cathy, you probably all will have something to say on this, but Glen, if we go to you first.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, apologies for the hat. That's some local climate adaptation going on. But in terms of your question on climate justice, as you quite rightly say, through COP, it did emerge quite a lot, and is very prominent in my research at the moment, where I'm looking specifically at flood risk and flood risk management in England. We're collaborating with teams in Finland, France, and Belgium as well, and we're looking at ways of raising the profile, essentially, of the topics of equality and justice in flood risk management, and relating that to climate change adaptation more broadly. But a useful metaphor I've found in my work since April, since starting on this, and a more well-known kind of disaster, not more well-known disaster, but you're probably all familiar with the Grenfell fire in London. And since that event, there's been inquiries and investigations into the type of insulation material or cladding that they use in buildings, and the extent that that material contributed to the devastating effects of that fire in a tower block. But it's a useful kind of way of thinking about justice in flood risk management, for example, is how are different people affected differently by disasters, be they, in this case, it wasn't climate change related, but flooding, a climate change related disaster. How are different people impacted by those events? And also, what capacities do people have to prepare for future events, be it from the whole scale of options that are available to them, be it subsidies or some people luckily are able to completely move out of areas that are flood prone. But delving deep into those questions, you are looking at questions of equality, and you're looking at questions of justice as well. And that's distributive justice, so justice and how the impact of decisions of the decisions and policies made is distributed, but also processual justice and people's ability to participate in governance and decision-making processes that kind of shape their ability to be resilient, I guess. So without fully remembering if that covers the initial question, there's a bit of a rant on justice and equality.
Thanks, Glen. Cathy, would you like to weigh in on that?
Please. Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, so as I mentioned in my previous comment, our city and district is actually an area of high situation. It is one of the highest areas of unemployment in Northern Ireland. Our health indicators are some of the poorest. And, we are an area that has a high level of vulnerability. So with that in mind, everything we do with climate change has to be looked through that lens. So at a very practical level, things we do, for instance, would be to basically GIS map, our areas of high social deprivation, overlaid with our potential flood risk maps, and then overlaid with potential urban heat island effect and hard surface cover mapping. And that really informs a lot of our priorities in terms of where we need to prioritize flood resilience actions, community resilience planning. And it also prioritizes where we need to direct our efforts in terms of green infrastructure. So if we think about, in the city, we need to think about if we're going to be developing our green infrastructure to alleviate heat and flood risk, we should be directing and developing that in areas of high social vulnerability. So there's all those factors, as well as making sure that we're thinking about climate justice in terms of climate mitigation and that just transition. And we're working at the moment with universities and the college try and look at how we can better upskill our local communities for that green recovery and that green transformation and green transition, but making sure we leave no one behind. But I have to say, this is a big task. It's not just for council, and we have to work with all the other agencies in the Northwest and across Northern Ireland to deliver this, because no one of us can do this alone. So collaboration is key.
Thanks, Cathy. Glen, I see your hand raised again. I'll go back to you before we go to Adam.
Yeah, just very quickly, because it was basically a quick question for Cathy. It's because once you do start adding layers like that on GIS, you can quickly come to the conclusion that there's no space left. I'm just wondering if Cathy has any experience or ideas in terms of approaching the affected people about that information.
Yeah, so in terms of the information that we use for our GIS layers, it would be from the Northern Ireland Statistics Agency, and they would develop what's known as super output areas, which is based on a whole range of indicators and the census data that tells us the areas of highest social deprivation. However, there's nothing like local knowledge. We are all council officers who work in the city and district, who live in the city and district, most of us, and we know the areas of highest social deprivation. We also work very closely with other organisations such the food banks, and they'll tell us where the areas that are most vulnerable are. So we use that local knowledge as well to then inform where we need to prioritise for community resilience planning, and then flood alleviation schemes as well.
Thanks, Cathy and Glen. Adam, would you like to weigh in on that question about climate justice?
I would, but I think in the interest of time, I'd like to just pass the floor, if I can, to some of the participants. We have Marco Vander right here, who's doing a lot of interesting work in Brazil. My colleague Olen Ursu from Ukraine with UNDP there, so we can expand it a little bit. I think much more interesting than hearing me talk about it.
Yeah, actually, I think there's a question there for you, Adam, on the potential impact of diet change, how to see what are the key potential levers for behaviour change. And I think this is something we touched on already, that the pandemic showed that behaviour change can be rapid, but people do go back to old habits. How do you think that can be addressed?
It's a very important issue, and I wish I had a good answer for that, because if I did, then I would definitely be promoting. But until people are exposed, and diet is one of the hardest things to change. People get used and set into certain patterns. It's very cultural, very family oriented. We eat how our parents ate. But I think through the right information, as people are caring more and more about their health and about the impacts of their actions on the world and the communities around them. We care about others in our community. When we see that some of the decisions are actually hurting others in our community or the less fortunate, then we tend to take. But it's tough. Behavior change. And behavior change communication is always one of the most challenging areas of outreach and of this work. So I think it's peer to peer. It's teaching by example. I think of adopting the right diets and having conversations. It has to happen on that interpersonal level. But it is a big challenge, and you have whole societies now shifting towards heavily meat-based diets, like we see in China, we saw it in Japan. Then it's a bit discouraging. But I see Marco turn on his camera. If I may, sorry, Jennifer, you're moderating, so I just want to reduce my time and get some of the other participants.
No, that's okay. And if anybody else would like to weigh in on that, Marco, you asked that question, and if there's anything you'd like to add to it, please do.
Well, I asked the question because Adam and I had many conversations about it, but in general, on any sort of sustainable development activity, behavior change seems to be one of the biggest one. And I was encouraged by the positive side effect of the pandemic to see that people could actually change their behavior rather quickly and actually took the benefits out of it. But we see insufficiently happening that with the issues around sustainable development, which is diet, is travel, it reaches all of us now, and I see how difficult it is. I think meat in the end, and Adam and I had a conversation about it. I quit red meat 3.5 years ago, and I'm very, very happy with it. And it's not such a big problem, but other behaviors are more complicated. And I think if we really want to at a global scale, and particularly because you are looking at the integration of the 3 points and the SDGs and the Paris Agenda and the Sendai Agenda at the same time, that really forces us to think about behavior change, all of us, on a significant level. And I think we insufficiently look at that sometimes. And I think trying to find those touch points to really do that and keep those behaviors change is something essential. So looking at solutions on the broad scale of the SDGs and the other points, we need to see what can we do differently. A conference like this is fantastic because basically we sit globally together and we can talk, and we got very comfortable with this. So business travel in that sense is much less necessary, but a difficult topic, as Adam said.
Glen, I see your hand raised if you'd like to weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, just another complication I see there specifically related to nutrition and foodstuffs as well is the cost of some of these things, right, to the consumer. Is that sometimes let's call, I don't know, there's various terms you could use, but more sustainable alternatives tend to be quite expensive as well, and that can be a bit of a barrier to some. Talk about just transition as well. And I think there's, for me, sometimes a bit of a contradiction in terms of, or a bit of a conflict perhaps between the wish for some food producers just to make profit, you wonder what the true agenda there is, whether it is to reduce meat consumption or get rich quick, to put it kind of a short way, I guess. So there are difficult conflicts there, I think.
If I may just jump in, Jennifer, just to add to what Glen was saying, there's a whole policy dimension there. Yes, there's private sector companies that are trying to get, but they get rich within policy, subsidies that are made by, and then the lobbying that goes in to provide those subsidies to certain areas of the farming industry, to certain crops, corn in particular, that has a high fructose level, which is leading to diabetes. It's leading to very unhealthy diets. It makes some foods much cheaper. So it is, yes, it's part of some companies getting rich quick, but that's within a policy framework that we all influence. Sustainable development is really, it's a governance issue about providing the right regulatory and policy frameworks in place, taking subsidies out of environmentally harmful economic activities, and putting the subsidies more into the areas that are better for our health and better for our economies and better for our societies.
Thanks, Adam. I'd just like to address one final question. I think we just about have time for. Sherry asked a question in the chat about what is the benefit of carbon offsetting, and maybe to share what's happening in vulnerable countries that have experienced loss of biodiversity. For example, the climate risk of what Dr. Gina Garai spoke about, natural capital and the healthy forests. Should we consider the devastating flooding recently in British Columbia due to the summer heat dome and loss of the natural capital from crops in the area, and the 3 atmospheric rivers that exposed our communities to floodwaters? So if anybody has anything they'd like to weigh in, certainly the issue of carbon offsetting in vulnerable communities is very interesting. Stephen, I see you have your hand raised there.
I can't speak so much as an expert on carbon offsetting, but just on the topic of devastation from floods, I think climate change is one driver amongst many. So it is twinned very much with biodiversity loss, and this book doesn't talk too much explicitly about biodiversity loss, but we are undergoing a twin crisis in terms of biodiversity, significant mass extinction event, and climate change, and a lot of extreme weather events are made more impactful because of land use change that we have undertaken to make our ecosystems more vulnerable. So whether it be reducing mangrove forests in coastal areas, or changing forests into farmland, we're changing the drainage systems, as Gina mentioned as well. We're changing drainage systems, we're changing the landscape, and we're making ourselves more vulnerable by some of these actions that we're taking. So we're exacerbating impacts of climate through not protecting our biodiversity and through land use change as well. So it shows those interconnection, I suppose, between disaster risk, climate, and sustainable development in terms of biodiversity.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. We have 2 more minutes left. If anybody else would like to contribute to that question, or any other final remarks.
Just very quickly, also that what Stephen says is very true, but the opposite can be true as well. There is interesting work into nature-based solutions that look to marry those kind of objectives as well. So the flip side, just perhaps draw some optimism out of it as well. Definitely, that is very interesting work as well.
Okay, thanks, Glen. I guess we'll finish up and keep to time, and thank you everybody for joining this evening in Ireland and afternoon in the US. Thanks to Daniel and Stephen, Adam and Cathy and Glen. I think the title "Creating Resilient Futures," the book has brought together some really important themes in the current times that we're experiencing. Stephen mentioned that it's a message for hope, and that's not something that's heard in relation to climate change, but I think it sounds like it's a very important message if we're to take the action that's needed. And connection and interconnectedness is a theme that runs through the book, along with inclusion. And hopefully this book and the work of those who contribute it will help to inform approaches going forward, both among practitioners and researchers, but also those making global decisions. So thank you all very much for joining.
Thanks, Glen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Anya.
Cheers,
Bye-bye.
folks.